Welcome to Biblical Literacy with John Donnelly. Today we're going to be looking at the story of David and Goliath. So I suggest you either pause the video and read 1 Samuel 17, or after this video familiarize yourself with the text, as I'm going to be referencing parts and pieces of the story, but we're not going to read the entire story as it's about 50 verses long. So David and Goliath, we get an image of this story in our minds from Sunday school, from a young age. And typically the image that we get is a little boy up against a big giant with a small stone. And we're going to be looking at some issues with this text and see if maybe this picture here is not really accurate at all. So the first issue we want to look at is, how tall was Goliath really? And if we look in our Hebrew text, the MT, the Masoretic text, they have him at 6 cubits in a span, which is approximately 9'9". So about a 10-foot tall guy, which would be taller than any man that's ever been recorded in modern history. The tallest man is about 8'10". So this would be kind of outside of normal heights of people. And is there any other options out there? Are there any other texts that show him to be a different height? Well, there is. In fact, the Septuagint, the LXX here, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, has him at 4 cubits in a span. This is translated, this is old, this is translated 2nd century, 3rd century before Christ. So this is a very old translation of the Old Testament into Greek. They have him at 4 cubits in a span, which is about 6'9". And we also have 4Q Samuel. This is a Qumran scroll. So this is a Hebrew scroll from around the time of Christ, before Christ, has him at 4 cubits in a span as well. So there are other options out there. In fact, the older options are these here. Which is more likely? And many scholars would argue for the older 4 cubits in a span than for the 6 cubits in a span. So David, how tall is David is another question. So Goliath at 6'9", who's he up against? Well, David, if he was an average Semite from the time, he would be between probably about 5 foot, 5'4", is what we see by grave records. The average male was around 5'3" at that time. And so, a guy that's 5'3", 5'4" up against a guy that's 6'9", that's a giant. Anybody that tall, that big would be quite impressive. And we know that Saul was actually a head taller than most, so Saul's actually probably taller than 6 foot. And he's probably a better match for Goliath as a bigger man, but more about that later. So we have some descriptions of the armor that Goliath is wearing. It says that he's wearing 5,000 shekels of armor, about 125 pounds of armor, which is about 25% more than the average hoplite warrior, who wore about 100 pounds of armor. So we've got bronze scale armor here, 125 pounds, quite a bit. But our modern military men, they run with 100 pounds of equipment on them. So it's not again, not a giant, somebody who can carry hundreds and hundreds of pounds, but about 25% more, which makes sense if he's about 6'9". And another thing is, Goliath's sword is able to be used by David in battle. Not only does Goliath get killed with his own sword by David here, but also later on we find the sword when David is fleeing Saul. We find the sword in the temple, and David asked the priest, "Do you have any weapons here?" And he says that we only have the sword of Goliath. And David says, "Give it to me, for it is like no other." And he uses it in battle. So again, his weapons are not so big, so huge that he's off the charts. So, how tall is Goliath? he's a tall man. He's a very tall man, probably one of the tallest men in that army. But he's probably no mythical beast that the Hebrew text suggests to us. So another question we have to ask is, how old was David when he killed Goliath? The text calls David a na'ar in Hebrew, a na'ar. That word na'ar can be translated as unmarried males. What it really what it means. You could still be a na'ar at 40 years old if you were unmarried. So, how old is David? Well, he's probably less than 20 because he's not with his brothers at war. You had to be 20 to fight in the army. So David is probably closer to 15 to 19, but he's fully grown. He's able to handle himself as a shepherd. He's certainly not a little boy here at all. And remember, King Saul takes his offer seriously and even puts his armor on him. David is able to stand with this armor. Now, David doesn't want to wear the armor because he's never used it before. He says, I'm not used to this. I'm better off without it. And it probably was a little bit big on him, but certainly he's not a little, 4'10" little kid that weighs 60 pounds, soaking wet. So, how old is David? He's a grown man. He's grown. He's just not old enough to fight in the army. But, any 16, 17, 18-year-old guy, he can hold his own. And David is not a little nerdy kid. He's a shepherd. He's a strong warrior. He's out there fighting, defending his flock from bears and lions and things like this. So, the shepherds were really like the cowboys at the time. They're very strong and able to handle themselves very well. So another question we need to ask is, what is this weapon that David has? So what is an ancient Near Eastern sling and a sling stone? So a sling is got a picture here, kind of a sling. It's a couple pieces of leather with a little pouch that could hold a stone. And you can see from this picture, the average sling stone, it's not a little pebble. So, again, looking at here, we have a serious weapon of war. We're not dealing with Dennis the Menace's slingshot here. Slingers were the artillery of the ancient world, just like the archers. They were used to hurl big boulders up into cities and take out all kinds of things. They were bowling for the legs of the animals that they were fighting. As the horses would come, they would take out the horses. And these are serious warriors, and this is a serious weapon. Sling stones range in size from that of about a golf ball to about the size of a pool ball. So imagine, a pool cue coming at you at over 100 miles an hour. How much damage that could do to you. And he takes 5 stones, and I would say he takes 5 stones because that's about all he could carry comfortably in his pouch and still be agile and run. So we're talking about baseball size, tennis ball size rocks, stones here, and they would get them from the streams because the streams would make the stones nice and soft. And in a pinch, if you needed some nice round stones, you grab it from the stream very easily. So here's an ancient Assyrian wall relief, and you can see the slingers here behind the archers. And here's a closer up picture of that shot, and you can see, I've circled some of the stones there in the pouches. You see how big they are. You see the stones in the hands of the slingers as well. Here's piles of stones on the ground next to the slingers. And then these are actual stones that were picked up from the Battle of Lachish that were found at that dig site. So you can see, obviously these were not made in a river. These were made, chipped away and rounded off for that purpose. But you can see how big these are. These are the size of a tennis ball. So another issue we want to look at, and this is kind of the big one here, and one that could be difficult to accept, but I want you to keep an open mind and kind of try to stay with me here. So where did David hit Goliath with this stone, really? So the text says that the stone struck Goliath's frontal. And just about every translation in English will translate that as forehead. Okay, so it hits him in the frontal, singular. But what is Goliath wearing on his legs? Well, the text describes those things that are on his legs as frontals of bronze. So let's take a look at our Hebrew a little closer here. So, almitz ho. Okay, so upon his frontal, singular. All right, hits him one. And here's one here. So, umitzo. So this here is a plural form, but it's actually defective spelling. And so he's got these frontals of bronze upon his legs or feet. You know, the foot in the ancient world was from like the knee down. Same with the hand would be from here out. It's the same in India today. They use those words interchangeably. So feet and hands. You know, the greaves on the feet. It's the whole from the knee down. So here we have a plural form, but we have David striking Goliath in a singular, which would make sense if he's swinging a sling stone. If he was to hit him not in the forehead, but in the shin, in the greave, in the leg, he would hit him in the singular greave. Now, the Israelites at this time didn't wear greaves, so they didn't have a separate word for greaves. So when the author describes what the armor is, he just says they're frontals of bronze, which is a perfectly good explanation of what a greave is. Frontals of bronze upon the legs. So you can see here clearly we've got the same root, mitzah. So, you know, what's the issue? What's going on here? Let's take a look at some other context clues that kind of help us to understand that maybe he was hit not in the forehead but in the leg. So in the text it says that the stone sinks into the frontal and Goliath falls forward on his face. So we have this stone coming at such a force that it actually says it sinks into the frontal and Goliath falls on his face forward. Now, yes, they're coming forward. They're going to fight. You know, if you were running at me and I shot you with a gun, you would probably fall forward. But if you're running at me and I hit you with a pool cue at over 100 miles an hour, maybe 130 miles an hour in the head, I don't think you're going to fall forward. I think you're going to fall backward, is what I would say. That makes sense. But again, it's just another clue, something to consider. Now, again, if I hit you with this cue ball size stone in the head, you'd probably be dead. But Goliath is not dead. And David actually has to go run, says the text says he ran to kill him, and he takes his own sword and kills him. So, again, kind of some context to kind of show us, you know, perhaps he did get hit in the leg. Now, if he was wearing 125 pounds of armor and other things and went down with a crushed leg, he's going to be pinned. He's going to be pinned down in his armor. David's going to have enough time to run upon him, take his own sword, and cut off his head, kill him. So, where did David hit Goliath? I'm going to suggest that he hit him in the frontal that's on his leg. The bronze greave. All right. So a few more items from this text that we want to look at here. You know, why did this translation always get forehead? Why was it always forehead over the years? And I think that it has a lot to do with the way the Septuagint translated it. And when the Septuagint translators went to translate this, instead of just saying that he got hit in the frontal or in the forehead, it actually says that he got hit in the forehead through the helmet. Through the helmet. And so they add that in there, you know, probably to explain maybe to explain how we got hit in the forehead through the helmet. Maybe, I don't know, but they added it to the text, and so this translation, Septuagint, gets used in antiquity for other translations. It was the Bible of the early church, and so, when more translations were made, they're going to favor the Septuagint and kind of not even think about it now, because now the translators have kind of spoiled the text by adding to it and giving that picture of the helmet when the Hebrew writer never had it there to begin with. So I think that's why, one of the reasons why, we really don't see a translation, greave or frontal on the leg at all, really, until the modern time, until we start having writing about it in the 70s. We do have instances of, in antiquity, we do have, like in the pseudepigrapha, we do have an account in the 12 patriarchs. Judah is said to take out the legs of one of the kings that he was trying to kill with a sling stone. We do have evidence that slingers were bowling for the legs. We do see that in other literature. So we see that slingers did practice this. They were taking out the horse's legs. They were, the legs were a big target to hit, and a good one to hit. So, we do have evidence for it, but, all right, so some things to keep in mind. So in the story, we also have, David putting the sword of Goliath, after the battle, he puts the sword of Goliath, it says, in his tent. Now this would have been blasphemy because the nature of the battle is actually a champion ordeal. So this is not a normal war here at all. And for David to take Goliath's sword for himself at this point in time would have been wrong. No, all the armor of Goliath goes to the temple, because ultimately it was God, Yahweh, that won the day, fought that battle, and he gets the spoils of war. And that's where we see the sword later on, is in the temple. So he puts the sword in his tent, his God's tent. This is his tent. So what is the nature of the battle? This is single combat, champion ordeal. So when two armies would come together, they didn't always kill each other and see who would win by having everybody just fight against each other. Sometimes they would say, okay, well, you send forth your champion, your best warrior, and we'll send forth ours, and whoever wins that battle will submit to you. Rather than killing everybody, having all this loss of life, they would allow the gods to speak through an ordeal trial, through a champion ordeal trial here. So that's what's going on here. That's the nature of the battle. So again, we have this, why does David take Goliath's head to Jerusalem after the battle? And we have to remember what's going on here in the text. Saul has been rejected as king. Kingdom has been torn to him and given to David. David has been anointed king by Samuel, but has not been recognized as king yet. But David knows what happened. He remembered getting anointed as king. He knows the Lord. He knows what's going on. He steps forward as the champion of Israel. Now, Saul should have been the champion of Israel, as the king of Israel. He should have been that champion. He should have went forward and fought Goliath. But remember, Saul had the evil spirit from the Lord. The Lord withdrew from him, and Saul knew that God wasn't going to fight for him. So he's afraid. He's hiding. And the real champion of Israel steps forward, accepts that role, and wins the day, wins the battle, and is protected. So why does David take the head to Jerusalem? Well, David knows that he's going to be king someday. And he basically takes the head to a city that he wants to conquer. Because in the ancient world, they would do that. They would take the heads of their enemies that they had just conquered. They would bring them to the next city they were going to conquer as a way of intimidating them to give up and to come out. Now, that's not going to happen yet with Jerusalem. But I believe this is in here to show that David, he knows what he's doing. He knows that he's going to bring the throne of God to Jerusalem. He knows that he's going to bring the temple there. And he puts Jerusalem, basically puts them on notice and says, I'm coming for this city someday. And so I believe that's what's going on here, and that's what those around him understood. So another interesting thing is in the book of Daniel, in chapter 2, we have an image of a statue. The statue has different parts and pieces, gold and bronze and iron and clay. So this image is another thing that comes up here. So it's kind of similar. We have a similar story here. In the image, we have a stone not made from human hands, which is a sling stone, which is cut by the water. It's not made by human hands. It comes out and strikes the image on the leg, and then destroys it, crushes it, rises up over it, and destroys it. And that image is the anti-God kingdom, really. It represents the kingdoms of that time: Assyria, Babylon, Persia, Greece, and Rome, but also that Antichrist future kingdom. And the stone represents Christ, the Messiah, conquering that anti-God kingdom. So we kind of see that recapitulation here from the story of David and Goliath in the image of Daniel's statue, Nebuchadnezzar's dream here. So an interesting pattern that emerges, something to consider as well. So today we looked at David and Goliath. The context of David and Goliath gives us a very different picture than we see in Sunday school. And maybe perhaps a better image would be more like Bernini's David, a strong man with a big stone in his hand, or perhaps even Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel David and Goliath. You can see him, a fully grown man, standing over a bigger man, able to handle himself. So I think these are better images for us to think of when we think of David and Goliath than the Sunday school image of the little kid with a slingshot. But that's all I have for you today. Go ahead and read this 1 Samuel 17. Take a look at it and be interested to hear your feedback. Have a good night. God bless.